Gunfire erupted across the Arizona desert as a ruthless outlaw gang stormed onto the ranch of a quiet rancher's wife, seemingly an easy target. But these hardened criminals made a chilling mistake. The woman they kidnapped was no ordinary frontier wife. Beneath her gentle demeanor lay the most feared gunslinger the West had ever known, a legend whispered about in terrified saloon conversations. Bound and taken to their hideout, she secretly prepared her vengeance, patiently plotting every move. Her plan would unleash chaos, exposing corruption at the highest levels, bringing down an entire empire built on treachery and blood. Folks, you won't want to miss how this courageous woman single-handedly dismantles an outlaw empire. Be sure to subscribe right now, support our channel, and stick around for an explosive tale of justice and legendary courage you'll never forget. Arizona's Copper Mesa region had never been for the faint of heart. From the rolling sagebrush flats, shimmering beneath the relentless sun, to the rugged mountains that thrust up like sentinels guarding secrets older than any living soul, the land itself seemed carved from grit. Some folks came for the promise of wide open spaces, enough to raise cattle, build ranches, and make a future. Others arrived with greed fueling their hearts, searching for gold veins, silver lodes, or any other treasure hidden beneath the parched earth. But in the summer of 1885, something darker held Copper Mesa in its grasp. The Copper Mesa Gang. Led by the cunning and merciless Elias Iron Eye Mercer, this gang had risen to power through a violent combination of intimidation, bloodshed, and strategic alliances with men no less ruthless than themselves. In less than 2 years, they went from unknown drifters robbing stagecoaches to an outfit that controlled nearly everything between the Mexican border and the wide blue Colorado River. Lawmen tried time and again to dislodge them. Federal marshals, local sheriffs, even bounty hunters with near-legendary reputations. Yet Iron Eye Mercer and his band of renegades slipped every noose, neutralized every posse, and evaded every trap. It was whispered in saloons from Tucson to Santa Fe that the Copper Mesa Gang had friends in high places, perhaps a few lieutenants in the army, or some politically connected land barons who found it profitable to keep the outlaws in business. But the truth was simpler. The gang was extremely good at shutting down trouble before it took root. They had watchers in every town, eyes on every approach, and enough funds from their robberies and forced protection fees to buy loyalty where brute force failed. So unstoppable did the gang seem that even the U.S. Marshal's office in Phoenix approached them with caution. A few officials quietly advised local ranchers to pack up and leave rather than try to stand tall. No price was worth life or limb, and the Copper Mesa Gang wanted absolute control of the water sources that dotted the desert. Their biggest target that summer happened to be a seemingly modest property known as the Brockton Ranch. At first glance, the place didn't look so different from others in the region. A small but sturdy ranch house made of adobe bricks, a hand-dug well, a reasonably sized corral, and a handful of barns used to shelter the livestock. If any trouble arose, the ranch's owners, Helen Brockton and her husband Daniel, didn't appear to have the manpower to fight back. And if the gang wanted that ranch as well or prime grazing land, there was little question the Brocktons would be forced to hand it over. Yet appearances can be as deceptive as a desert mirage. For hidden beneath the day-to-day facade of quiet ranch life lay an unspoken truth about Helen Brockton, a truth the Copper Mesa Gang would only discover once they took their ruthlessness too far. By the time they realized their error, the currents of fate were already carrying them toward a reckoning bigger than even Iron Eye Mercer could orchestrate. Helen Brockton woke each morning before daybreak. The moment the sky began its slow shift from star-freckled indigo to the hazy light of dawn, she was on her feet, hair braided back in a neat plait, boots laced tight. She would check the livestock first, her bay mare, 2 mules, a small herd of hardy cattle bred to withstand the scorching summers, and the goats that provided milk and cheese. Satisfied all were well, she returned to the ranch house to tend to her next task, stoking the kitchen fire, making coffee, and preparing the day's schedule for herself and Daniel. The routine was purposeful. It wasn't just about managing daily chores. It was about maintaining an existence that gave no hint of the life she'd once led. It was about quiet discipline and watchful vigilance. Even in these tranquil dawn hours, Helen's gray eyes missed nothing. Every rustling of dry grass, every silhouette on the ridgelines surrounding the ranch, every unexplained movement on the old trails, she saw it all and filed it away. Daniel Brockton, a gentle-natured man with a quiet humor, had married Helen 8 years ago in a small ceremony near Yuma, where he had once briefly worked as a carpenter. He was neither a gunslinger nor a brawler, but he possessed the iron-spined integrity that frontier living demanded. With a short-cropped beard and weathered hands, he looked every bit the diligent rancher who had carved out a life by sheer determination. Together, they had turned this remote piece of desert into a modest but self-sustaining ranch, forging a bond of mutual respect and affection that outsiders might mistake for cautious formality. On any given day, visitors saw a calm and capable ranch couple. But there were times, rare glimpses, when Daniel's gaze would linger on Helen's hands as she handled their old rifle, or on the graceful, almost too quick way she could pivot and aim in one fluid motion. It was as if some ancient reflex still lived within her, something that no amount of domestic life could fully erase. Indeed, whenever he heard swirling rumors from the local saloon about the dangers prowling these parts, Daniel would glance at Helen, and the unspoken understanding passed between them. They had prepared for trouble. They always had been. Still, few in prosperity-minded circles, especially those working for the Copper Mesa gang, had any notion that the woman who measured feed for goats in the early morning might once have been known by another name. A name that rang out in hushed recollections of the Redwood Pass incident a decade prior, when a lone gunslinger had dropped a dozen men in less than a minute and walked away without a scratch. There were variations of the legend. Some said the gunslinger was a ghost, some said it was a man too quick to be real, and others swore it was a woman. All stories, though, agreed on one point, that the Redwood Pass shootout was a near supernatural display of skill. The dust had long settled, and that figure disappeared from the West's lawless corners. If anyone realized that figure was now living quietly under the name Helen Brockton, no one had dared breathe a word. As the days grew longer and the Arizona heat cranked itself up, talk of the Copper Mesa gang's ambitions reached every settlement's ear. They had begun annexing water sources, offering deals to ranchers and homesteaders that left them no choice but to sell. Those who refused found burnt barns, poisoned wells, or missing family members. With each acquisition, Elias Mercer's men extended their domain, ensuring that travelers and merchants alike became reliant on the gang's say-so and could be charged exorbitant fees for safe passage or water rights. No one dared cross them, or if they did, they never lived to recount the experience. Helen and Daniel watched the developments through snippets of news gleaned from traveling merchants and townsfolk. A local named Harrison Moore, who ran a modest supply route, mentioned the gang had set their sights on controlling every major well along the stretch leading to the Mexican border. The Brockton Ranch was perched near a natural spring that never ran dry, even in the harshest summer months. Should Mercer decide to claim it, the future for the Brocktons would become precarious indeed. And so Helen took on a new layer of vigilance. After finishing chores, she would wander the property's edges, examining footprints in the dust, scanning for traces of campfire ash, or signs that watchers had hidden in the rocks. She had a quiet method of reading the desert, following the trails coyotes made, distinguishing fresh hoof prints from those a day old, and noting any bullet casings left by careless riders. Sometimes her calm, concentrated eyes would catch a glimpse of movement. A distant figure, perhaps with a glint of something metallic near their shoulder, likely a rifle carried too casually. Then she would vanish behind a boulder in a single fluid motion, gone from sight. From that vantage, she might watch the watchers, mentally mapping their approach and posture. Daniel trusted her instincts. He never questioned why she examined the horizon with the intensity of a hawk, or why she quietly carried a small revolver beneath her apron. In truth, he found comfort in Helen's readiness. He knew her well enough to sense an undercurrent of a skill that no typical rancher's wife possessed. He also understood that if trouble came to their doorstep, the best place for him might be behind her, not in front. They rarely discussed her past. She told him bits and pieces, how she grew up wandering the frontier with her father, a traveling judge who taught her to read and handle a firearm. She admitted she'd seen terrible violence and had once taken steps to stop men who deserved no mercy. But she never disclosed every detail of the Redwood Pass shootout or how her marksmanship was once the talk of every dusty bunkhouse across 3 states. Knowing the essence of her skill was enough for Daniel. If the day arrived when she needed to show it, no one would have to ask for a demonstration. When the Copper Mesa gang first arrived at the Brockton Ranch, Helen had anticipated them for days. Standing on the wooden porch on a scorching mid-June afternoon, she watched 5 riders appear on the southwestern horizon. The glint of sunlight off metal, the dust plumes trailing behind them, classic signs of a group approach. These riders maintained a half-circle formation, leaving no flank unguarded. Even at a distance, Helen sensed this was an organized crew. She walked inside to retrieve a tall canteen of water and positioned herself back on the porch, seemingly casual, but with every muscle coiled and alert. Daniel, having observed the riders, finished stashing certain items, a ledger of land documents, and more importantly, an old trunk containing a particular revolver and a small stash of ammunition hidden under the floorboards. He joined Helen outside, leaning against a post as if engaged in idle conversation. "They're coming from the south, from that old foot trail that leads near the canyon," he remarked softly. "They're not locals. Locals would use the main track." Helen nodded. "Likely from Mercer's group, come to negotiate. Let them talk." Her tone was calm, measured. "But watch their hands and be ready to move inside if I say so." Within minutes, the 5 men rode up. The lead figure, a heavy-set man with a pockmarked face, dismounted while the others kept their horses in a tight arc behind him. He removed his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Afternoon, folks. Name's Clive Thorne. Got business with the owners here." Helen offered a tight smile. "We're the Brocktons. Go ahead, speak your piece." Clive's grin bared yellowed teeth. "I come on behalf of Elias Iron Eye Mercer. You might have heard of him." "We might have," Daniel said warily. "Well, Mercer's found that life's easier when neighbors see things his way," Clive explained, letting the threat hover in the simmering air. "We aim to purchase your ranch outright. Pay in gold, no fuss, no trouble. We think you'll find the offer generous." Helen arched an eyebrow. "We're not selling. This place is our home." Clive's men exchanged glances, some chuckling under their breath. The lead messenger pretended to look saddened. "Shame about that. This region's about to see some changes. Big changes, if you catch my meaning. Folks who sell now, they do so with a pocket full of gold and no regrets. Those who don't, well," he paused to let the weight of his words land. "Trouble has a way of finding them, especially with so many outlaws roaming around." Helen kept her composure, her voice like quiet steel. "You can tell Mercer we respect his reputation, but our land isn't on the market." Clive gave a theatrical sigh. "Suit yourselves. Iron Eye's not a man who likes hearing no. You've got a few days to rethink your position. After that, we'll be back. Could be tomorrow. Could be next week. And if you haven't changed your mind by then, you'll regret it." He twisted his lips into a mocking grin, stepping back toward his horse. "Now, missus," he said, "I'd hate to see this place burn down or have your livestock vanish. So do think carefully." With that veiled threat, he and his men spurred away, leaving a swirl of dust in the ranch yard, the tension lingering like an uncoiled rattlesnake. The dust hadn't even settled before Helen turned to Daniel, her expression unchanged but a dark spark in her eyes. "They'll be back sooner rather than later," she said, voice low. "But they don't plan to come politely next time." Daniel swallowed hard. "It's just the 2 of us out here. Even if we fight, we can't hold them off indefinitely." "Shush, worried." Helen nodded. "We're not going to fight them head on, at least not in the way they're expecting." She glanced around the yard, letting her gaze rest briefly on the small outbuilding that housed the ranch's tools. "I've spent the last few days double-checking the perimeter. If they come in force, we won't stand a chance toe-to-toe. So we have to be smarter." Inside, as the sun dipped low, they planned. The immediate notion was to move valuables, and that included her special revolver, into a more secure hidey hole. If the gang came in the dead of night to surprise them, they needed quick access to weapons without advertising it. They also discussed an evacuation plan, which direction offered the best chance to slip away should the ranch be overrun, where a hidden water cache lay waiting in the desert, and how they might signal for help from any passing lawman. But the law in these parts was ironically tethered by Mercer's reach. If the Copper Mesa gang was half as connected as rumors said, relying on outside rescue might be a fool's errand. Helen's face grew thoughtful. She stood in the middle of their small living area, the flicker of lantern light casting dancing shadows across the walls. There's also something bigger going on, she mused. They're sweeping up every water source. That's not just for petty extortion. It suggests a grand plan, maybe using these routes to smuggle something or build an empire of control. Each time I spot one of their men, they carry themselves with a certain discipline, like ex-soldiers. This is beyond random outlaws. Daniel wasn't sure how to answer, but he sensed her unspoken meaning. In the 8 years they'd been together, he'd come to learn that her instincts were rarely off the mark. If she perceived a larger plot, it was likely there. She was already strategizing how to confirm it, quietly and without alerting the gang. And her stance, the angle of her shoulders, the calm in her eyes told him she was ready to step back into a role she had forsaken long ago. Before turning in for the night, she did something she rarely did in front of him. Opened the old trunk that had accompanied her from her prior life. Daniel had cracked it once to store spare linens, and she'd almost panicked, telling him never to dig through it. But now she lifted the lid. Nestled among old documents and a battered leather duster was a revolver in an oiled canvas wrap. Its barrel was pristine, the grip customized, and the name Silverhawk etched into the side. Helen took the weapon into her hand, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she set it aside. "If they come tonight," she said softly, "we'll be ready. If not, I'll head into town tomorrow and see what else I can learn." Sleep did not come easy. The desert wind sighed across the barren land, rustling brush and whispering in the gaps between the adobe bricks. Now and then, Helen swore she heard the shuffle of boots outside, the click of metal against rock. But when she checked discreetly from the window, she found only open darkness. Each time her hands longed for the reassuring grip of that revolver. Yet even in these tense hours, she breathed slowly, reminding herself that fear made the mind jump at shadows. Calmness was her ally. She had to conserve her energy for the real confrontation. Dawn arrived with slanted rays of rose and gold. Dust motes swirled in the early light as Helen prepared the wagon. The plan was straightforward. She would ride into the nearest town, Copper Bend, about a 2-hour trip, to gather feed and medical supplies. More importantly, she would have an opportunity to listen to local chatter, gauge the gang's movements, and possibly pick up a telegraph if her old contacts had sent any messages. Daniel stayed behind to guard the ranch, using the time to fortify the doors and set up a few hidden lines of defense. The ride to Copper Bend was uneventful, but filled with a tension that sat like a knot in Helen's gut. She recalled simpler days, when traveling to town was a welcome chance to trade gossip with neighbors, sample sweets at the local bakery, or restock on coffee. Now, every yard traveled felt laden with caution. In her lap lay an old, battered ledger containing ranch finances and purchase lists, an innocuous reason to visit the bank and general store. But hidden beneath it was a loaded revolver wrapped in cloth. Copper Bend was busier than usual, the dust of numerous hoof prints swirling on Main Street. Helen guided the wagon around a cluster of wagons belonging to traveling merchants. She glanced at the saloon, noticing 3 men wearing the copper insignia pinned to their vests. That insignia was the new mark of Mercer's top enforcers. She recognized 2 from rumored descriptions. Hank Riley, known for settling disputes in the saloon's back alley, and Polson Grimes, a horse thief turned gangster. They glared at passers-by like predators sizing up potential prey. Helen parked the wagon outside the general store. Inside, she found old Mr. Hendricks behind the counter, his usual warm expression replaced by an anxious line across his brow. As she ordered flour, sugar, and a few small items, she slipped a hint of her real purpose into the conversation. "Seems the trails are getting crowded with fellas wearing copper pins," she remarked casually. "Heard they've been taking an interest in water rights, maybe driving up land prices. Must be good for business." Hendricks grimaced. "Not for us folks who gotta live here. They keep raising protection fees. My shipments cost more every month. Last week they threatened to break my son's legs if I didn't pay up." He dropped his voice. "If you've any sense, Mrs. Brockton, you'll do as they say, whatever that might be. They're unstoppable now, Rumor is they have connections to some big shots in the cavalry. Federal forces can't touch them. Helen's gaze flickered. She lowered her voice further. They've already made an offer on our ranch. We refused. Hendricks stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. Then you'd best reconsider. I've seen what they do to holdouts. No piece of land is worth going up against those devils. Helen gave a small nod of thanks and gathered her supplies, stepping out into the street just in time to catch a snippet of conversation from the men wearing the copper pins. They were grumbling about some unfinished business at a ranch a few miles out of town. She paused, adjusting a crate in her wagon, listening closely without making direct eye contact. Ah, got no word from the boss yet, one man grumbled. But you know Mercer wants that well. If them Brocktons won't sell, we'll take the place by force. Helen's pulse quickened, so the timetable was speeding up. She climbed into her wagon seat, heart pounding, but her face remained carefully composed. She snapped the reins, guiding her horse away from the store. Her plan had been to also stop by the telegraph office, but she decided that might draw too many eyes. For now, she had what she needed, confirmation that Mercer's men were getting impatient. She took a meandering route out of town, looking for vantage points to see if she was being followed. Twice she spotted riders in the distance, but they didn't approach. Each time she varied her path, cutting through a dry creek bed, passing near a patch of mesquite trees. In her old life, trailing and counter-trailing had been second nature. Her body remembered. She took mental notes. The reflection of a spyglass from a ridge, the footprints that looked fresh in the dusty bank, the way a cluster of crows took flight at a spot where no traveler should have been. By the time she reached the final stretch leading home, she was certain no one was directly behind her. Daniel stepped from the corral when she arrived, sweating from hours of repair work on the property fence. Without greeting her verbally, he offered a subtle nod, an unspoken question about whether she had gleaned new information. She responded with a single, grim nod. Inside, away from prying eyes, she relayed everything she had heard. The men with copper pins, their talk of taking the ranch by force, and Hendricks' bleak warning. They'll come soon, she concluded, scanning through the supplies she'd purchased. We might not have days. Could be they strike tonight if they're bold, or in a day or two. She paused, meeting Daniel's worried gaze. They're not just bandits. They're organized, ex-military perhaps. And Mercer's bigger plan might tie in with cavalry or out-of-territory shipping. I'm not sure yet, but I do know we can't simply wait for them to overrun us. Daniel nodded, inhaling shakily. What do we do then? Helen's lips curved in a slight, determined smile. They think we're an easy target. Let them keep thinking that. Sometimes the best way to root out a snake pit is to let them think they've already triumphed. That evening, Helen double-checked the ranch's defenses. Over the past few days, Daniel had installed reinforcing beams behind doors and shutters, turning each potential entry point into a barricade. She tested each board, each nail, ensuring they were sturdy but not so obvious as to raise suspicion should the gang's scouts peek through windows. Next, she inspected the hidden compartments in the floor, verifying her old Silverhawk revolver and a lever-action rifle were secure and easily accessible. Ammo, packed in small belts, was spread around the house, stashed behind furniture or in baskets of feed, so that no matter where they might get cornered, they could reach ammunition. From the barn loft, she watched the sun sink into a blazing red horizon. The desert's hush was broken only by the distant call of a coyote. She felt the dryness of the air cling to her lungs. Memories of Redwood Pass swirled in her mind. She recalled the thick tension before that legendary showdown. Although the Redwood Pass incident had started as a small-time feud among outlaws, it escalated into a gunfight that left half a saloon's patrons dead. She had stepped into that fray to protect innocents, or so the rumor went. Some said she drew her weapon in self-defense. Others swore she'd come specifically to kill a band of murderers. Helen rarely spoke of it, but the memory remained. The crack of guns, the blur of bodies, the ring of bullet shells on the floor. She'd walked away wounded and furious, determined never to be forced into such bloodshed again. Now, more than a decade later, she realized fate might push her into a similar conflict. While Helen kept watch from the loft, Daniel quietly worked on one more measure: tripwires. He ran thin cords from fence posts to small bells or clusters of old tin cans around the perimeter. It wasn't a sophisticated alarm system, but it might give them a few extra seconds of warning if a group approached under cover of darkness. Better to have a jangle of cans than an ambush right in their living room. Around midnight, the moon gleamed silver across the desert floor, and a suffocating silence descended. Helen remained alert, scanning with her father's old spyglass from a vantage point. A few times, she glimpsed shapes passing across distant ridgelines, but they never ventured closer. Maybe the gang was biding its time, confident that the Brocktons would break under fear alone. Or maybe they planned a massive strike at dawn. Either way, Helen refused to be caught off guard. She stayed awake until the first hints of morning. Only when the sky began turning pale did she allow her shoulders to relax, waking Daniel from his dozing at the kitchen table. They both recognized that the lull before the storm had grown shorter. Each sunrise could be their last as free ranchers on their own land. Daniel made a pot of coffee, and they sat together in the pre-dawn quiet. "When this is all over," he said softly, "let's consider a trip up north. See the pine forests. I hear the summers there aren't so scorching." Helen placed her hand on his, a rare display of affection when tension ran high. "I'd like that," she replied, "but first, let's make sure we still have a home to come back to." Paragraph 9, word count 585. At noon the next day, as the heat shimmered off the desert, another pair of riders appeared. This time, they came brazenly through the front gate. One rider carried a parchment scroll. The other kept his hand near his revolver, scanning the yard. Helen and Daniel stepped onto the porch, carefully presenting themselves as a couple either curious or mildly concerned, but not outwardly hostile. The first rider called out, "Helen and Daniel Brockton, we bear a message from Elias Mercer." He dismounted, walked to the porch, and handed over the scroll. "You're invited, well, more like summoned, for a direct discussion at Camp Mesa tomorrow midday. The terms are simple. Accept Mercer's final purchase offer or expect retribution." Helen calmly took the scroll. "And if we don't come?" she asked, her voice level. The rider's lips twisted into a nasty smile. "Then Mercer will come here. And trust me, ma'am, you'd rather talk terms in his camp than have him set foot on your property with all his men." Without waiting for a response, the pair remounted and rode off. Helen stared at the scroll, feeling a knot of tension coil in her stomach. After she unrolled it, her suspicions were confirmed. It was an official demand, signed by Mercer himself, offering a sum of money that was laughably below the land's value. The note ended with a final line. "You have tried our patience long enough." Daniel exhaled. "Looks like we either walk into their territory or wait for them to invade ours." "Neither option is a good one," Helen agreed. "But going to them might give us an advantage. We'll see what they have in place. How many men, maybe get a glimpse of the bigger picture. If I walk away from that camp with enough knowledge, we can plan a real defense. Or at the very least, call on outside help if there is any." She rolled the parchment tightly, pressing her lips together in deep thought. "Yet it's a risk. If they sense a trap or realize who I am, they might take me hostage." Daniel's eyes flickered with worry. "Is that wise?" Helen met his gaze. "We have to find a weakness. The ranch's well is important to them, but I suspect they have bigger ambitions. If I can glean that information while playing the frightened wife, we might exploit it." She paused, chewing her lower lip. "But I'll need your promise. If something goes wrong and I don't come back soon, you'll do what we planned. Get our documentation, ride to the nearest outpost with a working telegraph, and send for help." Although Daniel's jaw tightened, he nodded. They'd had this conversation before. A plan to alert certain old contacts Helen had once hinted at. Men who owed her a favor from the Redwood Pass days, or so she claimed. They spent the rest of the day making careful preparations. Daniel moved his personal rifle to a hidden slot in the stable where he could grab it if needed. Helen packed a small sidearm in a discreet holster under her riding skirt, a weapon easily overlooked if the coppermen patted her down. Tomorrow at midday, she would ride to Camp Mesa, stepping willingly into the lion's den. It was a gamble, but that was the path forward. Dawn arrived clear and bright. Helen spent the early hours settling her chores, feeding animals, and kissing Daniel goodbye with a lingering embrace. She wore a plain brown skirt and a loose white blouse, her hair gathered in a simple twist. No one would guess the speed and precision that lay coiled beneath that demure exterior. She double-checked the revolver strapped high on her thigh, hidden by the drape of her skirt. A small derringer also rested in a custom pocket, courtesy of a tailor in Santa Fe, who specialized in discreet attire for ladies with secrets to keep. Camp Mesa lay about an hour's ride southeast. The route meandered through scrubland, past rocky outcroppings, and across a narrow wash that was typically dry this time of year. She expected watchers from the Copper Mesa gang, and sure enough, halfway through the trip, a lone rider perched on a ridge signaled her to continue. She gave no sign of noticing him, adopting the demeanor of a dutiful wife terrified for her homestead. In truth, her senses were honed. She could almost feel that rider's eyes on her back as she proceeded down the slope and into a wide flatland dotted with tents and a few hastily built wooden shacks. At the center of the site rose a large canvas pavilion emblazoned with a crudely painted copper-colored emblem, a stylized eagle with extended wings, the calling card of Mercer's expanding domain. Beyond the tents, she spotted evidence of a small arsenal, crates stamped with U.S. cavalry on the sides. That revelation made her breath catch. So the rumors were true. Someone within the army or a supply depot was funneling top-grade equipment to Mercer. This was bigger than water rights or a mere land grab. She dismounted near a hitching post, where two armed men promptly approached. "No weapons inside," one said, voice bristling with authority. "Hand over your sidearms." Helen feigned nervousness, rummaging in her satchel to present a small, barely loaded revolver, one she purposely brought as a decoy. The guard nodded, but to her relief, he didn't pat her down or check her legs. The second man jerked his head. "Boss is waiting." They guided her to the main pavilion, pulling aside a flap of heavy canvas. Inside, a table stood in the center, bearing scattered maps and documents. Around it loomed four men, rough, muscular types who were clearly used to violence. At the table's head was Elias Iron Eye Mercer himself, taller than she'd imagined, with a hawkish face, a scar carving across his brow, and a single glint in his right eye that seemed almost metallic in the lamplight. He regarded Helen with open curiosity, perhaps expecting a meeker presence. "Well, well," Mercer drawled, rising to his feet. "Mrs. Brockton, I take it. I'm pleased you decided to visit our humble operation. I assume your presence means you're ready to negotiate." Helen breathed in slowly, letting a tremor pass through her shoulders to sell the role. "You didn't leave me much choice, Mr. Mercer," she answered, voice quavering, just enough to appear intimidated. I came to see if we can come to terms, or at least gain more time before any violence." She cast her gaze around. "My husband and we don't want trouble." Mercer offered a predatory smile, gesturing for her to sit at a makeshift chair. "Of course you don't. I'm sure we can find an arrangement." And with that, the lion's den closed around her, unknowing that the unassuming visitor was a hawk in dove's clothing. Helen Brockton sat amid the den of wolves, her spine upright and her gaze lowered, carefully playing the role of a frightened rancher's wife. Inside the torchlit pavilion, the air felt heavy with sweat, gun oil, and the subtle tang of tension that comes when violent men gather to finalize deals. Elias Mercer took his seat again, his well-crafted boots propped on a chest that, judging by the markings, had once belonged to an army unit. Behind him stood Clive Thorne, the heavyset man who had threatened the Brocktons, and another figure Helen recognized from whispered rumors around Copperbend, Gerald Bates, known for quick violence and rumored to have scouted for the cavalry before deserting. Laid out on the table were various documents that caught Helen's eye: ranch deeds from the region, water rights certificates, and some official-looking papers stamped with the insignia of the War Department. No doubt these were pieces of the larger plot linking Mercer's ambitions to the black market dealings of certain corrupt army contacts. She willed herself not to stare at them too pointedly. "Now, Mrs. Brockton," Mercer said, leaning forward with practiced charm, "I'm a man of business. I see an opportunity in these lands, especially the water sources. You and your husband have a fine well that never runs dry from what I hear. Properly tapped, it could supply thousands of head of cattle, mine to be precise. And if we reach an agreement, you'd walk away with a handsome sum of gold." Helen let her shoulders slump a little, as though defeated. "We've heard the rumors that you want all the wells so you control who can water their herds. Some say you're smuggling arms, and the land provides cover from the law. She paused as if frightened by her own bold words. But that's none of our concern, truly. We just, we just want to keep our ranch. It's been in my husband's family for generations. Mercer's face tightened, betraying a flicker of annoyance. Your loyalty to that patch of desert is touching, but this territory is changing. Men of vision are shaping a new frontier. If you don't adapt, you'll be left behind. Or buried. Clive Thorne rumbled a quiet chuckle. Better to be left behind than buried, he whispered. Helen bit her lip, feigning a reluctant surrender. If we sell, we'll be forced to start over somewhere else, in a land we don't know. The price you offered might not be enough. She forced a quiver into her voice, letting it tremble at just the right moment. Mercer lifted a brow, his calculating gaze raking over her. We're not in the habit of haggling. Our first offer was the kind one. After that, folks usually see the wisdom in cooperation. Is there something we can do to expedite your acceptance? She caught a glimpse of the men behind him exchanging glances, a silent exchange that suggested a plan B existed, likely involving guns in a violent takeover. Her pulse hammered, though she controlled her breathing. She needed more. More intel on the troop movements, more insight into how these criminals coordinated with potential cavalry contacts, and specifically how soon they planned to seize her ranch. All the while, she had to keep them from suspecting she was anything but a frightened rancher's wife. Mercer leaned back, tapping the hilt of his revolver with one gloved finger. Let's not waste each other's time. You come here alone, which tells me you're either very confident in your negotiation skills or desperate. My guess is desperation. His lips curled into a grin that carried neither warmth nor mercy. So I'm prepared to be gracious. I'll extend my offer for another 3 days. That's when my men move out again to finalize certain expansion efforts. If you haven't signed by then, the next time I come knocking will be with more than just a piece of parchment. Helen swallowed audibly, letting the dryness in her throat become apparent. 3 days meant something significant in Mercer's schedule. Perhaps a final push to occupy or secure strategic wells across the territory. If she could glean more details about that timeline, maybe she could sabotage or expose it. Thank you for the extension, she stammered, shifting in her chair. My husband will be relieved you're giving us some time to think. Mercer smirked. Don't mistake mercy for weakness. When I decide to claim something, I claim it fully. If I have to run you off your land, or worse, I'll do it without a second thought. But if you comply willingly, it saves me trouble, and no one gets hurt. She gave a small nod, her gaze flitting briefly to the documents on the table. Maps with circles drawn around water sources, dotted lines connecting these points to trails leading out of Arizona and into neighboring territories. You must have big plans, she said softly, gesturing timidly to the maps. I've never seen so many wells scouted. Are you building a ranching empire? His eyes narrowed, scrutinizing her. For a tense second, she wondered if she had overstepped, if her curiosity might tip him off that she was more than she appeared. But then Mercer let out a bark of laughter. That's one way to put it, he said, though I prefer to call it forging a new economy. We have certain associates who need a secure supply route. Controlling water along the route ensures we control the flow of goods. That yields profit, much more than your modest ranch could ever dream of. Imagine caravans that pay us to drink from the wells, men who see no alternative if they want to keep their stock alive. Helen forced a nervous chuckle, as though impressed by his cunning. Sounds profitable, she said in a subdued tone. Inside, her mind whirled. So it was a supply corridor they sought, likely for arms or contraband. The official stamps on those crates near the pavilion still danced in her memory. If the gang was working with cavalry deserters or shady quartermasters, they might move stolen weaponry across the border. For that, a secure, well-watered route would be essential. One of the other men cleared his throat. We done here? Boss, we gotta load the next shipment before sundown. Mercer nodded as if dismissing Helen. Indeed. Mrs. Brockton, you have your 3 days. Make sure I get the answer I want. Otherwise, you'll wish you'd never tested my patience. Helen was escorted from the pavilion by 2 lower-ranked gang members who seemed more bored than suspicious. They led her to her horse and allowed her to ride out freely. The sun was high and scorching, but she barely felt the heat over the swirl of her thoughts. She had gleaned enough to confirm that Mercer's agenda was bigger than land extortion. He was entangled in a sophisticated smuggling or arms-running scheme, using land acquisitions as stepping stones to form a continuous chain of water sources from the heart of Arizona to the border. If successful, the entire region's lifeblood, its water, would be under his control. She took a circuitous route home, scanning for tails. This time she detected a lone rider trailing a half-mile behind. Probably Mercer's man, making sure she headed straight back, not off to some lawman's outpost. Helen maintained a casual pace. Never letting on, she was aware of the pursuit. Once, she stopped under a lone mesquite for a brief rest, checking her canteen and letting her mare drink. The rider held off, staying behind a ridge. Satisfied that she was harmless, he didn't try to close the distance. Back at the Brockton Ranch, she found Daniel exactly where she expected, in the barn, going through the hidden compartments to ensure everything was in place. When she dismounted, he hurried over, worry etched in his features. "Did they hurt you, or threaten you more directly?" She shook her head. "No new bruises, just new deadlines. They gave us 3 days to sign or forfeit everything. But there's more." She detailed everything she'd observed. The smuggling angle, the suspicious crates, the War Department stamps, and Mercer's mention of a major move in 3 days. Daniel listened, a mixture of alarm and resolve settling in his posture. 3 days, he repeated. That's precious little time. Helen pulled him deeper into the barn, away from potential eavesdroppers. "We have to assume they'll come in force if we don't agree. If I'm right, they need final control of our well as part of their route. They can't afford to leave us outside their network. We're a missing puzzle piece. That means they'll come at us with everything." Daniel's brow furrowed. "So we either run now or stand our ground, but we can't hold them off if they bring dozens of men." Helen nodded gravely. "Running won't solve the bigger problem, though. Even if we hide, Mercer's network will keep expanding. And if they truly have cavalry ties, it could become unstoppable. There's only one thing I can think of: expose them at a federal level. But for that, we need proof, and we need lawmen not in Mercer's pocket." She paused, recalling a name, an old friend who once served in the Territorial Rangers. "There's a contact I have, or had, Garrett Shaw. He used to investigate corrupt Army officers. If we can get word to him or to someone he trusts, maybe they'll mobilize a real response. But that means sending a telegraph to a place outside Mercer's control, maybe up in Canyon Bluff or even further." Daniel blew out a breath. "You mean I should ride out?" Helen placed a hand on his arm. "Tonight, under darkness. They're expecting me to be the main player, so they'll keep eyes on me. If you leave quietly, they might not notice until it's too late." He squared his shoulders, determination lighting his eyes. "I'll do it. We'll need to prepare carefully. If the gang discovers I'm gone, they might escalate sooner." Helen nodded, "Which is why we'll be very careful indeed." Night fell upon the ranch with an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint rattle of Daniel's preparations for a covert departure. He saddled a sturdy, sure-footed mare, packing a small bedroll, limited provisions, and a carefully wrapped bundle of documents Helen had curated. Notes on Mercer's men, sketches of the crates stamped with War Department insignias, and a concise summary of the threats made. The plan was for Daniel to slip out after midnight, aiming northwest to the old stage route, then cut across the desert to the next telegraph station. Helen walked with him to the edge of the corral, her breath steaming in the cool night air. "Once you've sent the message to Garrett Shaw or whomever he's working with, move on to the next station. Try to confirm it went through. If you can, deliver copies of these documents to local officials. Some might be in Mercer's pocket, but there's a chance you'll reach someone honest who can't ignore the War Department angle." Daniel nodded, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. "And what about you? If Mercer suspects, he might come here while I'm gone." Helen's mouth set in a determined line. "I'll handle it. I have a small plan to buy time, but it's risky. If the cavalry or the Rangers come through in a few days with our evidence, we might corner Mercer before he corners me. If not," she shrugged in a forced gesture of nonchalance, though Daniel could see the worry in her eyes. "I'll do what I have to do." They embraced. No more words were exchanged. Daniel led the horse out, using the darkness as cover, and soon Helen could only hear the faint clop of hooves fading into the distance. She walked back to the house, heart pounding, with a mixture of fear and resolve. The old trunk containing her guns was already open. She took out the Silverhawk revolver, rolling the cylinder between her fingers. The weapon had saved her life more times than she cared to remember, but it had also led her into that disastrous Redwood Pass shootout. Holding it now was like revisiting a past she'd tried to bury. The night stretched on interminably. She patrolled the ranch perimeter, stepping lightly to avoid rattling the tripwires, occasionally scanning the ridges with her spyglass. She saw no movement. Perhaps Mercer's men believed she was cowed by their threat, or perhaps they were lying in wait. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the sky, her nerves felt ragged, but no assault had come. Still alone, she prepared the day's chores. Feeding the animals was strangely comforting. It reminded her that life could persist despite the looming violence. As she gave a scoop of grain to her mare, a memory surfaced of the Redwood Pass fiasco, how she'd spent a quiet morning feeding a borrowed horse the day before bullets started flying. The recollection made her heart lurch, but she steadied herself. This time, she was no naive wanderer. She had a plan, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to save the ranch and countless others from Mercer's stranglehold. Morning rolled in with a brazen heat that foreshadowed another scorching day. Helen had to fight her instinct to constantly glance at the horizon, worried a dust cloud of riders would signal an approaching gang. After all, Mercer's ultimatum loomed, 3 days to sign or else. This was day one, and she had no illusions that his men would wait patiently. They might appear at any moment with a reminder of what refusal meant. To steady her thoughts, she decided on a seemingly normal routine. First, she headed into the barn to shovel out stalls and brush down the livestock, exuding an air of ranch life continuity. If spies watched from afar, they'd see no sign of panic, but her mind was racing. Each movement to the barn was also a chance to check a hidden stash of ammunition. Each trip to the shed, a reason to confirm her improvised barricades were still workable. By mid-morning, she decided it was time to head back into Copper Bend, or at least appear to. She readied the wagon, loaded a few crates of goat cheese and smoked meat, items she could sell in town, hoping this normalcy might lull the watchers. Inside her blouse was a small ledger listing every suspicion she had, coded in a personal shorthand she'd developed years ago. If she got the chance to slip it to a friendly local, maybe the information would spread. The route to Copper Bend felt oddly deserted. When she arrived, the usual bustle of townsfolk in the midday heat was subdued, as if they sensed trouble brewing. She pulled up at the general store. Mr. Hendricks eyed her from behind the counter with a fearful glance, and she realized why. In the corner stood a pair of men sporting those copper insignias. They followed her every move with predatory interest as she dropped off some produce for sale and took a short list of supplies in exchange. Helen forced a smile, made small talk, then exited, ignoring the crawling sensation on her spine. Outside in the glaring sunlight, she considered a stop at the telegraph office. But as she guided the wagon that way, she spotted yet another copper insignia man leaning on the rail. He tipped his hat at her with a smirk. Not good. They were definitely monitoring all communications. She pretended her horse had a limp, pulled the wagon up short, muttered something about needing new horseshoes and turned around. Retreating back to the open desert seemed safer than poking further into a nest of vipers. En route home, she diverted onto a side trail, heading up a rocky slope that overlooked Copper Bend. From that vantage point, she observed the comings and goings. A supply wagon arrived carrying crates that looked suspiciously like more stolen army goods. She noted the route it took, southward, presumably toward Mercer's main camp. The puzzle pieces aligned: supply lines, water sources, and armed men controlling each step. She dismounted, scribbling notes in her coded ledger, then resumed her journey home. Throughout it all, she never spotted Daniel on the horizon, which was good. If she didn't see him, hopefully Mercer's men didn't either. That afternoon, upon returning to the ranch, Helen was not surprised to see a lone rider waiting by the porch. He was tall, with lean muscles and a face weathered by desert life. She recognized him at once. Gerald Bates, the scout she'd met briefly at Mercer's pavilion. There was no friendly wave, just a cold gaze. "Good day, Mrs. Brockton," he said flatly. Boss wants an update. Thought I'd come check if you've changed your mind about signing over that land. Helen lifted her chin. Still thinking. I told him we needed time. Bates's eyes slid over her, lingering a moment too long. I noticed your husband isn't around. He off trying to find a buyer for your ranch on better terms? The question was laced with suspicion, as if he suspected Daniel might be contacting outside help. Helen shrugged. He went to see a doctor in Canyon Bluff. His chest pains have been acting up again. Stress can do that, you know. It was a calculated lie, delivered with a practiced nonchalance. If Bates suspected anything, Helen's calm would hopefully plant a seed of doubt. Bates grunted. Hope for his sake he's back soon. The boss doesn't like delays. He turned his horse around. Me and a few of the boys might ride by later, see how you're faring. Hate for you to be alone if you're feeling vulnerable. She forced a tight smile, though her stomach churned at the veiled threat. I appreciate your concern, she said. He nodded once, spurred his horse, and took off at a leisurely trot, disappearing into the desert haze. Helen watched him go, heart pounding. She knew full well he'd be scouring the area for tracks, possibly discovering Daniel's absence. She needed to cover any sign that Daniel had left during the night. The next hours were spent doing just that. She brushed away hoof prints near the corral, rearranged the feed to look like it had not been touched since morning, and left certain chores half-finished, signs that a man might still be around, stepping out for a moment. She also left her and Daniel's bed unmade, tossed a pair of his boots by the door, and scattered some tools in the yard. Anything to maintain the illusion that Daniel was simply out for a short ride or resting inside. When dusk fell, she lit 2 lanterns, one in the living room and one in the bedroom, so silhouettes might appear against the curtains, giving watchers the impression 2 people moved about the house. It was a delicate dance of shadows. More than once, she peered out through a gap, scanning the yard for any sign of watchers. She saw none but refused to trust the darkness. The desert was vast and Mercer's men were cunning. They could be a quarter mile away, observing through spyglasses. Her mind drifted to Daniel. She prayed he had reached the telegraph station safely. Every moment he was away increased the danger. But if he succeeded, the reward might be saving not just their ranch, but a swath of the territory from Mercer's tyranny. By the second day, the tension coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Helen's sleeplessness took a toll, but she pushed through, knowing that exhaustion was a lesser enemy compared to the lurking threat from the Copper Mesa gang. She fed the animals, checked the tripwires, and took a moment to make coffee on the stove. As she sipped, she replayed every detail of her conversation with Mercer in her mind, searching for clues about his next move. 3 days. That meant tomorrow was the deadline. Around mid-morning, a dust cloud announced the arrival of several riders. Helen's pulse quickened. This wasn't one man coming to snoop. This was a group. She stepped out to greet them with her stomach tightened, heart pounding. The men were the usual suspects. Clive Thorne, Polson Grimes, and 2 more she hadn't met. They were armed to the teeth. Clive dismounted, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "Where's your husband?" he demanded, dispensing with any pretense of politeness. Helen summoned her best exasperated sigh. "Still away. His health took a bad turn," she said, letting irritation color her tone. "Is it not enough that I'm here to speak on our behalf?" Polson Grimes snorted. "We're tired of waiting. Iron Eye wants an answer by tomorrow, and we're here to encourage you to decide correctly." Helen stood firm, hands on her hips. "I told Mr. Mercer already. I need to talk it over with Daniel. He should be back today or early tomorrow. If Mercer's so insistent, he can ride out here himself." She deliberately sounded piqued, hoping to play on their arrogance. Clive's eyes narrowed. "Watch your mouth, woman. We're giving you a chance to resolve this peacefully, but you're not making it easy." He gestured to one of his men, who slid off his horse and headed toward the barn. "We're going to look around. Make sure you're not hiding anything. If your husband's inside, we'll have a chat with him too." Helen swallowed, controlling her tension. "He's not here, and you've no right to." "Right?" Clive sneered. "We hold the only rights that matter in this territory now." Helen watched helplessly as 2 men rummaged through the barn, knocking over crates, spooking the animals. Another tried the house door, which she had deliberately locked. He slammed a boot against it, cursing when the reinforced beam kept it shut. Meanwhile, Clive circled her, measuring her with a predator's gaze. She held her ground, letting her fingers twitch slightly, as though she were frightened but too stubborn to flee. "You got some nerve," he muttered. "But that nerve won't save you if you keep stonewalling us. Where's your husband really gone?" "Canyon Bluff," she repeated, voice turning icy. "Ask Dr. Wilcox if you don't believe me. That's the only physician he trusts." One of the rummaging men shouted from the barn, "Boss, she wasn't lying. No sign of that fella, but they got store goods and what looks like day-to-day ranch stuff. Nothing unusual." Clive glared back at Helen. "Tomorrow's your last chance. Iron Eye Mercer himself will come if you don't sign by noon. And if he finds this place empty or uncooperative, you'll regret it. You got that?" Helen nodded stiffly, choking down her fury. Each time Clive or the others tried to intimidate her, she answered in clipped tones, never losing the mask of a nervous but proud wife left to handle bullies. If they sensed the warrior behind her eyes, they didn't show it. Eventually, after leaving a trail of disarray in the barn and a couple of smashed dishes on the porch, they rode off, presumably satisfied they'd done enough to scare her. The moment they were gone, Helen raced to survey the damage. Fortunately, they hadn't discovered the hidden compartments or the more carefully concealed weapons, nor had they broken through the house's reinforced door. She breathed a small sigh of relief, but that feeling quickly curdled into dread. Tomorrow was the final day. If Daniel hadn't returned, and if no cavalry or rangers arrived to help, she'd be alone against Mercer's full might. She carefully reset the tripwires, replaced the barricade behind the door, and cleaned up the wreckage left behind. With each chore, her mind whirled with contingency plans. By dusk, Helen was so tense her hands shook as she tried to make a simple supper of beans and cornbread. She forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need energy. The desert night pressed in, still and foreboding. She half expected Mercer's men to appear out of the darkness, guns blazing. But the hours rolled on without new arrivals. Unable to sleep, she climbed to the barn loft again, taking up a vantage point from where she could watch the approach roads. The night sky stretched endlessly, dotted with stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck. That serene beauty stood in stark contrast to the turmoil spinning in her heart. She remembered Redwood Pass again, how on the eve of that infamous shootout, she'd stared at the stars thinking about the line between right and wrong, how sometimes you had to stand your ground. She had done what needed doing then, and she'd do it again. But the cost, she knew, could be catastrophic. Close to midnight, movement on the horizon jerked her to full alert. She raised her spyglass, scanning a cluster of shapes that looked like riders. Fear swirled in her gut, but she soon realized they were too far east to be heading to her ranch. Possibly a patrol shifting positions or a supply caravan rerouting. Either way, it reminded her that Mercer's operations were in full swing, and tomorrow's ultimatum was only a piece of the puzzle. The real question was whether Daniel had succeeded in sending for help. If he had, it might arrive too late. But maybe, just maybe, in time for her to hold off Mercer's men. She stayed in the loft until pink light streaked the eastern sky. Day 3 was dawning, the day Mercer demanded a final answer. Helen clenched her fists around the spyglass. "Come on, Daniel," she murmured. "Hurry." The final day started quietly, yet the silence carried a sense of coiled menace. Helen felt as though the entire desert was waiting for something to snap. She spent the morning fortifying the interior of the house, pushing furniture against windows to create narrow firing slits. Should it come to that? The dryness in her mouth betrayed her nerves, but her hands moved with methodical purpose. A holdover from training she'd never really explained to anyone, not even Daniel. By 10 o'clock, she stood on the porch, scanning the horizon. Still no sign of Daniel. The hammered stake in her gut twisted with every minute. Did Mercer catch him? Had the telegraph reached the right hands? Was cavalry even able to move quickly enough to matter? She forced those thoughts aside, reminding herself there was work to do. She checked the trip wires one last time, made sure the livestock were sheltered in a rear paddock, far from where any gunfight would likely erupt. Then she re-entered the house to load her weapons. The lever-action rifle that hung near the door, a shotgun stashed under the kitchen table, and the Silverhawk revolver, her personal instrument of swift devastation if it came to it. At 11:30, a cloud of dust in the distance signaled multiple riders coming her way. She stepped onto the porch again, heart pounding, and counted at least 12 distinct outlines. At their head was the unmistakable silhouette of a man on a large black horse. Iron Eye Mercer had arrived. Helen forced herself to remain outwardly calm as they drew nearer. Despite the swirling dust, she could see Mercer's expression clearly. A cold, confident gaze locked on to her and the ranch behind her. He halted his horse a mere 20 paces away. Around him, a formation of armed men spread out, some dismounting to fan across the yard, cutting off any route of escape. Mercer's voice carried clearly. "Morning, Mrs. Brockton. I've come for your final answer. I trust you've had enough time to weigh your options." Helen let her eyes sweep over the assembled men, noticing the rifles, bandoliers of ammo, and the brazen copper insignias pinned to their vests. "I have," she replied, standing just off the porch, arms folded. "My husband's not returned yet, but—" "That's unfortunate," Mercer cut in, dismounting smoothly. "But my patience is at its end. You can sign the deed right now, and I'll pay you half the gold I offered. Or you can refuse, and my men will take this place. I'll leave it to you how many bullet holes go into the walls, or the occupant, before we're through." He stepped forward, his posture menacing, the scar on his brow twitching with each syllable. Helen took a measured breath. She glanced at the men fanning out behind him, some already stepping onto the porch. "I see negotiations are down to intimidation," she said quietly, refusing to tremble. "But like I told your man, this ranch is more than just property to us. We won't sell to bullies." Mercer's lips curled back in a feral grin. "Then you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." He snapped his fingers, and two men stepped forward, brandishing ropes. "Tie her up. We'll search every inch of this place, flush out that husband if he's hiding, and sign the deed ourselves if need be. Sarn." Helen stood her ground, but as they advanced, she allowed a flare of genuine anger to well up. Enough was enough. She turned slightly, letting her hand drop behind her skirt as though out of fear. In a flash, she drew the Silverhawk revolver and aimed it squarely at the first man's chest. Time seemed to slow. The men faltered, caught off guard by the sudden transformation of a seemingly meek ranch wife into a steely-eyed gunslinger. Before they could react, she fired a single shot into the air. The crack boomed through the yard, echoing off the barn walls. Horses shied, and the men froze. "The next one," Helen said, her voice cutting through the dust and tension, "won't be a warning." Mercer's face twisted with surprise, then fury. "You think you can outgun all of us?" He barked a harsh laugh. "There's 12 men here, 13 including me, and you're just one woman." Helen felt her blood pumping in her ears. The memory of Redwood Pass flared in her mind. A single woman taking on a room full of gunmen. She'd done it before. She might do it again. But here, the stakes were higher, the fight more personal. "Put down your weapons," she said, though she knew they wouldn't. "Or step away from my property." Iron Eye Mercer regarded her with a mix of grudging respect and calculating rage. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she cocked the revolver. "You won't live long enough to regret it if you push me." A pair of Mercer's men, either bolder or more foolish than the rest, tried to circle behind her. Helen pivoted, firing 2 shots into the ground near their feet. Dust and pebbles jumped, making them leap back. She was letting them see her speed, the dead accuracy, so they understood she wasn't bluffing. Another heartbeat of silence rippled through the yard. Then Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Take her!" he snarled. Gunfire erupted as half the men rushed forward, half raised their rifles. Helen dove for cover, rolling behind a water trough, the Silverhawk cylinders spinning under her practiced thumb. Bullets whizzed overhead, splinters flying from the trough sides. She clenched her teeth, waiting for the crucial half-second break in their volley. When it came, she popped up, squeezed off 2 shots, and dropped 2 men with precise hits. Arms not lethal, but enough to cripple them momentarily. She wanted them down but not necessarily dead, at least not yet. The old instincts roared back to life. This was Redwood Pass all over again, but now with more on the line. Her home, her future, Daniel's life. As the men reeled and shouted, Mercer himself dove behind the well's stone rim, cursing. "Don't just stand there, you idiots!" he hollered at his men. "Rush her!" A haze of gun smoke hung in the scorching midday air as Helen remained crouched behind the water trough. She could hear Mercer barking commands to flank her, to pin her down. The once peaceful ranch yard now roiled with the chaos of men scrambling for cover, bullets sparking off stones and wood. Her mind, honed by experiences she rarely spoke of, moved with lightning clarity. She mapped each threat's position, counted shots to gauge how many bullets they had left, and listened for the distinct sound of reloading. She had no illusions about her chances in a fair fight. 13 men, any of whom could kill her with a single lucky shot, versus her alone. But she never fought fair. That was something she learned in Redwood Pass. You turn every advantage, every scrap of cunning, into an edge. She breathed in, forced her heart to steady, and shifted positions. Two of Mercer's gunmen closed in on her right, approaching the fence line. She heard the crunch of their boots in the dust, their attempts at stealth overshadowed by frantic adrenaline. Helen's hands moved from the revolver to the lever-action rifle stashed behind the trough. She had placed it there earlier precisely for this contingency. Just as a shadow fell across the trough, she rose and fired a single rapid shot. The muzzle flash flared, and the first man dropped his weapon and collapsed, clutching his shoulder. The second man hesitated, eyes wide, giving Helen enough time to slam the lever and fire again. A bullet whizzed from the barrel, striking his leg. He howled in pain, dropping like a felled steer. "Damn it!" roared Mercer, popping up from his cover to take a shot at Helen. She flung herself flat, but not before a bullet tore through her sleeve, grazing her upper arm. Pain seared across her flesh, but she hissed through clenched teeth. It was a minor wound, not enough to stop her. A rush of footsteps approached from her left flank. She pivoted, scanning for a shot, but the men had taken better cover. Splinters rained as they peppered her trough with repeated shots. She rolled aside, scuttling behind the barn's corner, heart thudding. Each breath tasted of dust and gunpowder. She realized her rifle was nearly empty. In the midst of chaos, she caught a glimpse of motion by the ridge. A single rider. Her pulse soared, hoping against hope it was Daniel. The rider paused, then vanished behind a cluster of rocks. No reinforcements rushed in, so whoever it was, they hadn't decided to join the fray yet. Shouts of her name, "Mrs. Brockton, you can't hide forever," echoed in the yard. Then a chilling command from Mercer. "Set the place on fire. Smoke her out if you have to. We're taking that well, and we're taking her alive, or dead." Helen's mind flashed through a dozen possibilities. Fire was dangerous. Once started, it might consume not just the barn or house, but also trap her. She needed to preempt that. Swallowing hard, she darted to a nearby stack of fence posts. She reloaded the rifle with shaky but practiced hands, ignoring the throbbing in her grazed arm. She had to keep them off balance, keep moving. Redwood Pass had taught her the worst thing to do was stay pinned down in one spot. A flicker of orange reflected in Helen's peripheral vision. One of Mercer's men had lit a torch and was jogging toward the barn. Helen breathed a silent curse. The barn was old, its beams as dry as tinder under the unrelenting desert sun. If it caught fire, the flames would spread quickly, endangering her supplies, her animals, and likely her. She leaned around the fence post, picking her shot carefully. The torchbearer was weaving, but she squeezed the trigger, and the bullet struck him in the side. He crumpled, the torch sputtering out in the dust. Another wave of gunshots forced her back into cover. The men had begun fanning out again. She counted at least 5 or 6 still fully armed and uninjured, plus Mercer himself. The rest were wounded, moaning in the yard, or pinned down behind structures. Her breath came ragged. The scorching day was unkind to both sides, but she refused to let the heat blur her focus. "Helen Brockton!" Mercer's voice boomed once more, full of rage. "You got skill, I'll give you that. But this ends now. Come out, sign the deed, and I'll let you live. Chatterie." She glanced at her grazed arm, blood staining her sleeve. "Not a chance," she muttered. She'd seen what Mercer's mercy entailed, likely a forced signature, then a bullet in the back. She wasn't about to gamble her life on the word of a man who threatened neighbors for fun. Movement near the well drew her eye. Mercer was crouched behind it, reloading his pistol. He was a prime target, but the angle offered minimal exposure. She lined up her sights, exhaled, and fired. Her bullet ricocheted off the stone, forcing Mercer to duck. "Damn you!" he shouted. Suddenly, from the corner of her vision, she saw Clive Thorne creeping behind the water trough she had vacated earlier. He aimed a revolver in her direction, and she had no time to shift her rifle. She braced for a shot, but a thunderous report cut the air, and Clive's body jerked backward. A new bullet had ripped through him from behind. Shock rippled through the yard. Helen's heart gave a jolt of relief and confusion. Who had fired that shot? On the ridge, she spotted a silhouette, a rider with a rifle raised. As the figure guided the horse forward, Helen's eyes widened. It was Daniel, riding hard, a bandolier slung across his chest. Behind him, a second wave of riders followed, brandishing rifles and wearing the distinct insignia of federal marshals or cavalry. She couldn't tell from the distance, but the tide had turned. A triumphant shout tore from her throat as Daniel and the others charged in. Gunfire erupted anew, but this time from behind Mercer's line. Caught in a pincer, Mercer's men scrambled for cover, confusion swirling among them. Helen seized the moment, rising from her position to fire into the chaos. Shots rang out, men shouted in panic, and the yard filled with pounding hooves. Helen watched in amazement as Daniel led a small but determined cavalry of sorts. Likely men from the telegraph station or a group of traveling lawmen he'd corralled once he presented the evidence. She recognized at least 2 men wearing badges under their dusters, presumably federal marshals. Their arrival created an instant flanking maneuver, forcing Mercer's outfit to split their attention in 2 directions. Mercer roared, "Fall back! Regroup!" But the yard offered scant cover. The pinned men tried to run, only to be met by the fresh defenders' bullets or Helen's relentless aim. She felt no remorse for these invaders. They had come to steal her home, maybe kill her. They had terrorized good people in the region. Let them reap what they had sown. At the barn's corner, she caught sight of Polson Grimes lurching forward with a pistol. He aimed at Daniel's horse. Helen snapped a shot that caught him in the arm, and he spun, dropping the weapon. Then Daniel's new allies closed in, guns fixed on the man, who threw up his hands in surrender. Mercer, seeing the tide shift, mounted his black horse with lightning speed. He tried to rally a few men, but they were either downed or pinned. A savage desperation twisted his features. Without a second glance, he spurred his horse, galloping toward the main gate. Helen locked eyes with Daniel across the yard, and he shouted, "We can't let him get away. He'll regroup with more men." She nodded, adrenaline surging anew. She sprinted to the stable, ignoring the throbbing in her wounded arm, and flung herself onto her own horse, a sturdy bay with speed to match the black stallion. She gave chase, dust swirling behind her. The chase thundered across the desert plain. Mercer, led by about 50 yards, crouched low in the saddle, urging his horse with frantic intensity. Helen leaned forward, every bounce and jolt a reminder of her injury, yet she pressed on. She needed to end this. If Mercer escaped, he would return with reinforcements or slink away to continue his smuggling operation elsewhere. Gradually, the gap closed. She leveled her revolver, heart pounding. If she shot the horse, it might cause a messy spill, injuring them both. If she tried to shoot Mercer from behind, she might miss in the gallop's chaos. She steadied her breath, waiting for a smoother stretch of ground. The hoofbeats pounded in her ears, sweat trickling down her brow. Mercer twisted in the saddle, glimpsing her closing in. He raised his own pistol, but the awkward angle and the horse's speed threw off his aim. A wild shot rang out, the bullet whining off a distant rock. Helen saw her chance. She took aim, exhaled, and fired. The bullet caught Mercer's shoulder. He jerked, his grip failing. For a moment, he tried to stay upright, but the pain overcame him. He toppled from the saddle, hitting the ground hard. Helen reined her horse to a sliding stop, dust billowing around her. She dismounted, the dryness in her throat nearly choking her. Mercer lay sprawled on his side, groaning, one hand pressed against the bloody wound in his shoulder. His pistol had skittered several yards away. He glared at her, eyes full of venom. You don't know what you've done," he spat, each breath labored. "There are bigger players involved. I'm just a piece of the puzzle. Kill me, and someone else will step in." She caught her breath, leveling her revolver at him, though she sensed he couldn't put up further fight. "Then I'll deal with the rest," she said, her voice ice cold. "Or let the law do it." A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "The law? Huh. The law's on payrolls you can't imagine. Why do you think we got those War Department crates so easily? You think I'm the only one with dirty connections? Helen narrowed her eyes. She suspected as much from the start, but hearing Mercer confirm it stoked a fierce anger. This was about more than just her ranch. A network of corruption threatened the entire region. Her frustration at the crooked system surged, but she refused to let it paralyze her. We'll see how far those connections go once your men are in custody, and that stash of stolen army goods is seized, she said firmly. Hoofbeats approached. She turned to see Daniel and two marshals riding up, dust swirling around them. One of the marshals, a tall man with stern features, slid off his horse and approached Mercer, shackles in hand. Elias Mercer, by authority of the Federal Marshal Service, you're under arrest for extortion, attempted murder, and smuggling government property. Mercer groaned in protest, but the marshal yanked him upright and snapped irons around his wrists. Helen holstered her revolver, letting the adrenaline fade slightly. Then she turned to Daniel, who swung down from his saddle. She noticed the sweat, the dust caking his face, and the relief shining in his eyes. You made it back, she whispered, stepping closer, ignoring the throbbing pain in her own arm. Thank God, he nodded, breathless. Barely. I got your message to some honest folks. These marshals were riding through Canyon Bluff. They checked your evidence and agreed to ride with me at first light. I was praying we wouldn't be too late. Helen's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where smoke still hung from the brief skirmish at the ranch. You arrived right on time, she said softly. Then she winced as the pain in her arm flared. Daniel spotted the blood and gently guided her to a rock to sit. A marshal came to check her wound, offering a rudimentary bandage. We'll get you looked at by a proper doctor, he said kindly. But first, we have to secure the gang's arms and see what else is hidden at that camp. Helen nodded, letting the reality settle in. The immediate danger was over, but a larger battle, exposing the corruption behind Mercer's deals, had only just begun. Back at the ranch, a surreal calm replaced the earlier mayhem. Most of Mercer's men lay wounded or in shackles. A few had been carted off by the marshals for medical treatment under guard. Others, those who had died in the shootout, were lined up for identification and a proper burial. The yard was littered with spent shells, splintered wood, and the evidence of a violent clash. But the buildings at least still stood. Helen walked with Daniel among the marshals, pointing out the hidden compartments where she suspected Mercer's men would have tried to stash loot or evidence. Though the barn had been riddled with bullet holes, it hadn't burned. The animals were frightened but safe. The tension in her shoulders eased fractionally as she realized how close she'd come to losing it all. Marshal Tolan, a steady man in his 40s, surveyed the property with a practiced eye. I've seen operations like Mercer's before, he said gravely, shaking his head. They usually have connections in the War Department or cavalry supply lines. He wouldn't be able to do this on his own. Helen nodded. We found crates marked with the official Army stamp at his main camp, plus some stolen supplies were delivered to Copper Bend. Mercer hinted at a bigger conspiracy. Tolan exchanged a look with his junior partner. We'll have to coordinate with other marshals across the territory. The stolen army goods are a federal matter, and if cavalry officers are in on it, we need to root them out. This won't end with Mercer's capture. Daniel placed a hand on Helen's shoulder. I'm just glad we've ended it here at least. This ranch, it's our life. If you hadn't done what you did, he trailed off, eyes reflecting his gratitude. Helen gave a tired smile, her wounded arm bandaged but throbbing. We both did our parts. If you hadn't gotten the marshals, I'd have been overrun in minutes. She lifted her gaze to Marshal Tolan. We're willing to testify and share all the notes I've kept. I'll do whatever it takes to help unravel this entire web. Tolan nodded appreciatively. I admire your resolve, Mrs. Brockton. Not many would stand up to a gang like that alone. He didn't push for details on her uncanny gun skill or her rumored Redwood Pass past. Perhaps in the chaos of the day, he gleaned enough to sense there was more to her story than she let on. But for now, he seemed content to let her keep her secrets. By late afternoon, a small medical wagon arrived from Canyon Bluff, bringing a doctor who tended to Helen's grays and the gang's wounded. Meanwhile, the marshals collected statements from townsfolk who arrived, wide-eyed, to see Mercer in custody. Whispers spread quickly that the Brocktons had somehow outlasted the Copper Mesa gang's assault, aided at the last minute by federal help. Some were awestruck, some openly grateful that Mercer's tyranny might be ending. Over the following days, a sense of relief gradually settled upon Copper Bend and neighboring towns. With Mercer locked up and most of his top lieutenants either dead or in chains, the Copper Mesa gang collapsed like a house of cards. Those who remained scattered into the desert, hunted by local posses or turning themselves in, hoping for leniency. The stolen army crates were confiscated, and the marshals launched an investigation that would eventually expose a network of corrupt officials in charge of quartermaster inventories. For Helen, life didn't simply revert to normal. The ranch stood, battered but intact, and the well that Mercer had craved so badly remained under her ownership. Yet the illusions around her quiet life had been shattered. Townsfolk began whispering about her incredible stand. Some claimed she was a seasoned ex-ranger. Others said she was an avenging spirit come to torment outlaws. A few older drifters, who remembered Redwood Pass, whispered in hushed tones, "Could that be the ghost from Redwood Pass? The woman who took down a dozen gunmen in under a minute?" Helen, for her part, avoided such rumors. She tended to the ranch, helped Daniel with repairs, and cooperated fully with the marshals when they needed statements or details. Her bandaged arm healed slowly, but it was a small price to pay for victory. Each morning she woke to the solace of her land not under siege. She was free to feed the livestock without scanning the horizon in dread. Daniel sensed a change in her, though. She no longer carried that silent tension, as if a piece of her had been released by confronting Mercer. The Redwood Pass chapter of her life was forcibly reopened, and in a way, resolved. No longer would she live in fear of being discovered or letting her old instincts come to the surface. Instead, she embraced the knowledge that, when necessary, she could fight for what was right, for her home, and for the freedom of honest folks. One afternoon, Marshal Tolan stopped by with an update. "We're sending Mercer and his top men by train to Yuma Prison in a week," he explained, resting his hand on the pommel of his saddle. "We've also got enough evidence to go after some folks in the cavalry who were clearly funneling supplies to him. You did us all a good turn, Mrs. Brockton. Men like Mercer don't often see the inside of a cell, let alone hang for their crimes." Helen nodded, quiet satisfaction in her eyes. "I'm glad it's ending," she said. "What about Copper Bend? The townspeople need reassurance that this won't happen again." Tolan gave a grim smile. "We've stationed extra marshals there for now. Once word spreads that Mercer's finished, the vultures will likely move on. It might take some time to clean the territory of all the corruption, but this is a strong start." He fixed her with a respectful gaze. "And if you ever want to consider working with us, teaching us a thing or two about how you took down a gang single-handedly, you'd be welcome." Helen managed a laugh, though it carried a note of bittersweet resignation. "Thank you, Marshal, but I've had enough gun smoke for one lifetime, Redwood Pass included. I'm ready to spend my days raising livestock and living peacefully." News of the Copper Mesa gang's downfall traveled far beyond Copper Bend. Reporters from Phoenix arrived, looking for heroic stories of vigilante justice. But Helen refused interviews, politely directing them to the marshals for official statements. The rumor mill, however, churned out its own versions. Over drinks in saloons, travelers recounted how a lone rancher's wife outdrew half a gang and then forced them to surrender. The truth was more nuanced. She had help from Daniel and the marshals, but the legend grew faster than tumbleweeds in a windstorm. Daniel saw how these tales weighed on Helen. Whenever she rode into town, passers-by stared. Whispers followed her. "That's her, the woman who took down Mercer." She handled it with quiet grace, tipping her hat and moving on. But as soon as they got home, she sighed, her shoulders drooping. One evening, as they sat on the porch, she admitted her discomfort. "All I ever wanted was a normal life," she confided, eyes on the fading sunset. "I fled Redwood Pass because I was sick of living by the gun, of being on the run. Now I'm back in the spotlight, even if I never asked for it." Daniel placed a comforting hand on hers. "I know, but you can't help that you did something extraordinary. Again. People are bound to talk." She nodded, lost in thought. "At least we can stay here, keep building our life. The rest is just noise." She paused, smiling softly at him. "You were pretty extraordinary yourself, you know. Rounding up marshals, racing back in time. That was no small feat." He chuckled, squeezing her hand. "I guess we make a good team." They lapsed into companionable silence, watching the moon rise over the desert. The same desert that had nearly become a battleground for Mercer's grand scheme was now peaceful, if only for the moment. Helen closed her eyes, letting the soft night breeze brush her cheeks. She recalled her father's words from long ago. A gunfighter's life is quick and uncertain, but the measure of a person isn't in how many draws they win. It's in what they stand for when it matters. She had stood for her home, her husband, and for the well-being of others oppressed by the gang. Her father would have been proud. In the following days, as the marshals packed up Mercer and his men for transport, Helen and Daniel started the slow task of returning to normal. Their porch was repaired, bullet holes patched. The barn got a new door. Scorch marks were scrubbed away. Animals that had scattered or cowered during the assault were coaxed back. Slowly, methodically, the ranch breathed life again. Sometimes townsfolk stopped by, bringing pies or small tokens of thanks. A few left notes expressing gratitude for driving off the devil. Helen accepted these gestures politely, always clarifying that she hadn't fought alone. But the stories persisted, and folks insisted on calling her a hero. She learned to smile, nod, and gently change the subject. One bright morning, about 2 weeks after Mercer's arrest, Marshal Tolan rode up to the ranch with a stranger in tow, a lean, broad-shouldered man wearing a cavalry jacket without insignia. Helen and Daniel greeted them on the porch, curiosity piqued by the man's silent, watchful demeanor. Tolan tipped his hat. "Mrs. Brockton, Mr. Brockton, I'd like you to meet Captain Raymond Hollister of the U.S. Cavalry, well, formerly of it. He's part of an internal investigation team looking into the supply line corruption you helped uncover." Helen's eyes flickered. "Pleased to meet you, Captain," she said guardedly. Hollister dismounted, extending a hand in greeting, his expression sober. "I'm sorry for what you've endured. We've confirmed that certain officers within our ranks facilitated shipments of stolen arms to outlaws like Mercer. Thanks to your evidence, we've begun sweeping out the bad apples. We'll need your testimony, though, to make it stick in a military tribunal." Helen exhaled slowly, exchanging a glance with Daniel. They had anticipated something like this. "I'll testify," she said, voice steady. "Daniel will too, if needed. We've got no interest in seeing more infiltration happen under the Army's nose." Hollister dipped his head in gratitude. "We also discovered something else. Redwood Pass. Your name came up in records that indicated you might have been working as a civilian marshal or something. It's not entirely clear." His gaze shifted, filled with curiosity. A tightness coiled in Helen's chest. Redwood Pass was her old ghost. She could sense Tolan quietly stepping aside, letting her decide how much to reveal. She forced a calm smile. "I was involved in Redwood Pass, yes, but that was a long time ago. I was younger, impulsive. I did what I had to do to protect innocent people." Hollister studied her face, then nodded. "Well, it seems you haven't changed much, Mrs. Brockton. Still protecting the innocent, it seems. On behalf of the cavalry, those of us still loyal to the oath, thank you." She offered a polite nod. In truth, she felt a burden lift slightly, as though Redwood Pass were no longer a shameful secret, but a stepping stone to something better. The conversation shifted to practical matters, how she and Daniel would travel to deliver statements, the secure locations they could do so without risk of sabotage, and the need to keep ongoing investigations under wraps until more arrests were made. Eventually, Hollister and Tolan departed, leaving behind a swirl of possibilities. Daniel observed Helen's contemplative mood. "You sure you're ready to talk about Redwood Pass in front of an official tribunal? It's going to bring that whole chapter of your life into the open." Helen stood by the corral fence, gazing at the horizon. "I think I am," she murmured. "Hiding from it never made it go away. If it can help expose corruption and spare others from men like Mercer, maybe it's worth telling the story." Daniel's eyes reflected warmth and pride. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Helen turned to meet his gaze, her expression resolute but gentle. "I know. We'll face it together, just like we faced Mercer." The horse nickered behind them, and Helen stroked its mane, eyes drifting toward the endless desert. She might never fully escape the legend of Redwood Pass, but she had found a life worth protecting and a partner who believed in her. That alone made the rest bearable. A month later, Helen and Daniel found themselves on a train bound for Yuma, accompanied by Marshal Tolan. They carried carefully preserved documents detailing Mercer's smuggling operation, alongside Helen's coded notes about cavalry corruption. Within days of their arrival, they gave formal depositions to a military tribunal. Testifying wasn't easy. Helen was grilled by stern-faced officers who initially doubted how a single rancher's wife could have uncovered such an extensive conspiracy. Their skepticism melted once she began laying out the evidence, connecting dots they hadn't noticed. Daniel supported her account, describing how the gang had threatened them and how Helen's quick thinking saved the day. When Redwood Pass came up, an uneasy hush settled over the courtroom as she recounted how that long-ago shootout forged her reputation as a formidable gunslinger. She left out nothing, nor did she embellish. She simply stated facts: the number of men who died, the reasons she took up arms. The effect was profound. Even the most stone-faced officer had to acknowledge her clarity and sincerity. In the days that followed, the tribunal cross-examined Mercer himself. He spat curses, accusing Helen of espionage and the cavalry of hypocrisy. But the overwhelming evidence, including that from other captured gang members, sealed his fate. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of additional charges pending the cavalry's internal review. A wave of further arrests rippled through the ranks of quartermasters and officers who had colluded with him. On their last day in Yuma, Helen and Daniel strolled through the bustling streets near the fort. The midday sun was scorching, but a refreshing breeze blew in off the Colorado River. It was a relief not to be hounded by outlaws or suspicious townfolk. Most people here were simply busy living their lives, unaware that a major crackdown on corruption had just taken place in the nearby barracks. As they passed a small park, Daniel stopped under a cottonwood tree. "So," he said, hooking his thumbs in his belt, "what's next for us?" Helen leaned against the trunk, closing her eyes momentarily to relish the shade. "We head back to the ranch," she said softly. "I want to see the goats, the horses, fix that corral gate, plant some fruit trees come spring." He smiled. "That sounds wonderful." "No more shootouts? No more secret investigations?" She chuckled, though a hint of weariness touched her voice. "Hopefully not, but if trouble ever finds us, I guess we know how to handle it." She opened her eyes to meet his, warmth and trust reflected in her gaze. "We'll do it together, like we always have." Daniel reached for her hand, and they walked on. An old soldier, perched on a nearby bench, doffed his cap in greeting. Helen nodded back. She wondered if he recognized her from the hearings, but if he did, he didn't say a word. Perhaps that was best. She no longer needed fame or infamy. She'd learned the real measure of life wasn't how many folk whispered your name in saloons, but how at peace you could be within your own heart. Helen and Daniel returned to the Brockton Ranch by stagecoach and horseback, traveling over winding trails that once felt oppressive under the threat of the Copper Mesa gang. Now the desert seemed friendlier, as though the air itself was lighter without the constant weight of lawlessness. When they finally glimpsed their home, a mixture of relief and belonging flooded Helen's chest. The ranch appeared exactly as they'd left it: sun-baked adobe walls, a tidy barn with a repaired door, and corrals that cradled their animals with quiet security. Helen felt her eyes mist with gratitude. This land, so humble and unassuming, had been the stage for a life-and-death showdown that ended up shaking a criminal empire. Yet it still stood, steadfast. They fell back into the rhythm of ranch work. Mornings brought the usual chores: feeding livestock, gathering eggs from the chicken coop, mucking out stalls. The day's heat demanded a steady flow of water from the well, which never failed. Each bucketful reminded Helen how precious water could be in this frontier, precious enough that men would kill to control it. But the land was more than a resource to her. It was home. From time to time, visitors stopped by to check on them. Neighbors who wanted to extend thanks. Local merchants curious about rumors they'd heard. Marshal Tolan even rode through once more, ensuring the area remained clear of any resurgent gang activity. With each passing day, the tension of their recent ordeal receded, replaced by the gentle hum of normalcy. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and cast long, golden shadows across the yard, Helen stood by the porch and watched Daniel fix a broken fence post. A soft breeze carried the scent of mesquite, The sky above was a riot of oranges and purples. She recalled the final day of the hearing in Yuma, how an officer had asked her if she'd be willing to serve officially in the cavalry or as a special marshal. She had politely declined. She had found her place, right here. Daniel straightened, dusting off his hands. He met her gaze and smiled. There were no words needed. The love and partnership between them was stronger than ever, forged in the fires of adversity. They had discovered a profound truth, that the greatest peace came not from hiding one's past, but from using it when necessary to protect what truly mattered. Helen walked over, linking her arm through his. Together they ambled back toward the porch, where the gentle creak of a rocking chair invited them to sit. Night songs of crickets rose around them. The stars would soon emerge, bright and comforting. They might have remained silent, content in each other's company, if not for Daniel's quiet question. Do you ever think about Redwood Pass now, after all that's happened? She let out a long breath, considering the swirl of memories. I do, she replied softly, but it doesn't haunt me like it used to. It reminds me that I can make a difference, that I'm able to stand up when no one else can. And that, sometimes, is enough. They settled into chairs, feeling the solid ground beneath them. A reminder that they had built this ranch from the desert dust. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with unwavering resolve. The legend of Redwood Pass and the battle against the Copper Mesa Gang would remain stories told in hushed admiration around campfires. But for Helen and Daniel Brockton, the only story that mattered was the one they continued to write each day on this cherished land, living in quiet strength and quiet grace. As the dust settled over Arizona, justice had finally triumphed, proving that truth and patience could indeed defeat even the deepest corruption. Sarah Hawkins didn't just bring down an outlaw gang. She unraveled an entire network of conspiracy that reached the highest ranks of power. Her remarkable courage transformed the frontier forever, turning fear into hope and chaos into lasting peace. It's a powerful reminder for us all that bravery and determination can prevail even in the darkest times. What did you think of Sarah's incredible story? Did her actions inspire you or make you think differently about justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about this together. And don't forget to subscribe and join us for more unforgettable stories.